Like, if we allow it, if we allow the angel to break the addiction, that can be the very place in which we encounter God, and when we avoid the pain. I also think of Eustace in the dragon skin, like letting the pain go deep to shed the thing that needs to be shed can be the place of encounter with the divine. That then is the point at which we experience the transformation that allows us to experience what is real.
Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. I be Derek. Joining me today is Joel Wentz. We're going to be discussing C.S. Lewis's work, The Great Divorce, and I'm so privileged to have Joel joining me. A little bit about Joel that you might be interested in knowing. Joel and his wife, Jill, Joel and Jill, live with their 2 children in Portland, Maine. Joel has been in vocational ministry for 12 years, 8 years as a campus minister with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and he served for the past 4 years in his current role as teaching pastor at Missio Dei Church. Joel is also a musician, a big fan of tabletop games, and an avid, some would say manic, and I think you'll be inclined to agree, an avid reader. He reviews books and occasionally interviews authors on his YouTube channel called Books and Big Ideas. I had so much fun catching up with Joel as we discussed the ideas presented by C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce. As you know, The Plunge is all about deep conversations around the areas of theology, philosophy, and culture, and I'm excited that Joel was able to join us for episode 8 in our series on C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. Thank you for joining me, and thank you, Joel, for being willing to take the plunge. All right. Well, Joel, it's so good to be with you today, and we are opposite sides of the top of the continent here, or the U.S., I should say.
Yeah.
I'm here on Bainbridge Island, and you're in the outskirts of Portland, Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a bit of your background and how you made your way to your current vocation.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Derek. I'm really excited we're connected and excited to have this conversation. So at the moment, I'm on the outskirts in the woods. I actually live in Portland. I live not quite downtown, but my family, we live pretty close to downtown, and we absolutely love it. It's my favorite place in the world. And I'm not just saying that hyperbolically. It really is my favorite place. But I ended up there. That could take a whole podcast in and of itself. But the short version is that I went to grad school in the Midwest, and my life as it was at the time, I could kind of go anywhere I wanted, and so I cast a really wide net for jobs and found a job at a university, a little private university on the coast of Maine, and I thought, Maine's an exotic place. I'll just go live there for 2 years and try it out, and that was 14 and a half years ago. So, Maine got its hooks in me, moved here, just fell totally in love with pretty much everything about Maine, but especially Portland. I love the city of Portland, and found my way into ministry, which I could talk about too. Kind of big vocational change. I was never going to be in ministry, but I'm a pastor in Portland, and I just love it. I love living here. I love raising my kids here. There's a lot to love about this part of the world.
Beautiful. Well, could you, if you don't mind, maybe explain a little bit about that change and as you envisioned your future and what it's become?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've been on a winding road, as probably many of us. I was going to pursue a career in music, actually. That's what I studied originally, and then I found my way into the higher ed world. I love the university. I love academia for so many reasons, and I found my way into that world by way of a career in administration. Actually, that's what I studied in grad school. My first run through grad school. I've since gone to seminary for a second graduate degree, but yeah, I went to Ball State University in Indiana, got a degree in higher ed administration, worked at a university out here in Maine, and then found my way into that. Ignited, like being in New England ignited a love and interest in ministry, and so I fell in love with New England, the place, and it also awakened an interest in ministry because I had never lived in a, people use various terms: post-Christendom, post-Christian, secular. There's lots of different terminology for it, but I just had never lived in a place that fit any of those characteristics. I'd always lived in culturally Christian areas of America, and so yeah, moving here just opened up my imagination for ministry. I love the culture here. those things all combined, and I moved from higher ed administration to higher ed ministry. So I actually worked for a parachurch organization called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for 8 years, did campus ministry, and then I went from that into local church work almost 5 years ago. I've been a pastor for almost 5 years. So that's kind of the trajectory of how I ended up in the work that I do, and with the backdrop of loving the place that I live. So I don't want to paint an overly idyllic, rosy picture. Yeah, ministry is challenging. Ministry in New England is challenging. It comes with significant challenges, but it also comes with significant joys. And frequently those things are mixed together. So yeah, I do love that I get to do what I do in the place that I get to do it in.
And sorry, you mentioned, so I've got two questions to follow up because I'm just curious and fascinated by your journey. The first one is you had mentioned music. Was that as an artist, as a composer?
Yeah, we're opening up my vault of life secrets here. I don't, I don't talk to people about my music aspirations that often because it just raises so many questions. But I'm happy to talk about it. So I actually my undergraduate degree is in music business, and I was at one point going to move to LA and pursue the music industry as an artist. Yeah, that's another whole long story. I have a little bit of a New England connection to that because I did a 3-month music industry internship on Martha's Vineyard, the island of Martha's Vineyard. So I lived there for 3 months in college. That was the first time I'd ever lived in New England, and that was an amazing experience. But yeah, I was going to pursue songwriting, recording. I've had some aspirations of maybe being a session musician in studios. I do enjoy writing music. I haven't written songs very much in several years now, but yeah, that was my original plan, was some sort of music industry career. And but now I live in Maine and I'm a pastor, so things don't always go the way we expect.
Awesome. Well, I'm always curious, and it's been
Yeah.
interesting as this journey's unfolded for me. I've actually had a number of musicians or people who work in the music business as
Cool.
guests, and being someone who has very little musical ability, at least naturally, nor do I have the passion to devote myself to improving. I'm
Hmm.
always inspired to hear about those who have that gift and use it.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
um,
Well, that's cool.
appreciate that. At your church now, are you affiliated with a particular denomination, or what's the structure?
We currently are not affiliated with anything. We were affiliated with the church planting network. The church was planted 20 years ago, not by me, by my predecessor. I'm 38, so I guess theoretically I could have planted it at 18, but no, that wasn't me. I came in almost 5 years ago, and I guess kind of succeeded the church planter. He has moved on to other work, and we're still friends. But we're not affiliated with that network anymore. And it's funny, this keeps coming up. I'm actively praying about and thinking about and reflecting on what does it look like for us to affiliate with something. We live in such an interesting time ecclesially, and that question is I've been on a journey. My own personal ecclesial journey is also very interesting. I'm a denominational mutt. I've just so many influences. I'm actually a confirmed Anglican. Personally,
Okay.
I'm actually confirmed in the Anglican Church in North America. I love the Anglican liturgies and traditions, but I'm also deeply resonant with a lot of Anabaptist thinking. And so I have not yet found a denomination that's Anglican and Anabaptist. So if you know of one that combines those, you let me know. I think that might be part of the problem. But yeah, we're looking at that. I don't think it's healthy. We're a healthy place as a church, but I don't think it's good for us to be on our own for too long. So I'm hoping that we can find some network or some denomination or something we can link up with. But that's an open question for us right now.
Well, man, I really appreciate your transparency because I know this is your personal life. But I do think it's beneficial because I think many people, particularly those maybe my age and younger,
Mm.
I'm a bit older, I'm 51.
Mm-hmm.
The Gen X cohort and those on the fringes have certainly been navigating and wrestling with that question, particularly those of us who were raised in the middle of America, as you and I were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anyway, it's interesting. My own brother has found a home, as you mentioned, the Anabaptist, with a Mennonite group where he lives in Virginia,
Wow.
and a frequent contributor to these episodes is a gentleman named Chris Green, who's a bishop in one of the Anglican organizations. So interesting combination there for
Yeah,
me.
cool. That's cool.
Well, I suppose as much as I'd like to continue to explore the life of Joel, we'll
We will
move
exhaust that
into the
topic quickly, at least anything that's interesting. But
well, we can move into why we've gathered here today, and that's to talk about the Great Divorce more specifically, but C.S. Lewis
hmm
generally. And again, I really appreciate you participating in this series. My first question that I've asked all the guests on this
hmm
series, because I think it's fundamental to how our lives come to life as we grow and learn, and that's through story. So I'm
yeah.
curious if you have a memory of a story that was so captivating, whether it was as a young man or, even as recently as this week,
Mm.
where it took you away and you couldn't wait to get back to the world that it created for you.
Gosh, I love that question so much. Well, so the experience I'm going to recount, I don't know if it qualifies in that very last phrase you used about couldn't wait to get back to the world because it was a terrifying experience. But the story and experience that came to mind immediately as soon as I saw that question, I didn't have to even think hard about it, was when I read A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. And I think I was in fourth grade. I might have been even in third grade. I was pretty young, somewhere around 8 years old. And I don't think I'll ever forget the experience of reading that book. And specifically, I mean, there's so much beauty in that book, but there's one terrifying part of that book in which Meg is in the presence of, if anyone's read the book, there's this kind of disembodied, malevolent, evil brain kind of. It's a stand-in for authoritarian, totalitarian kind of power, which obviously I didn't know any of that when I was a kid reading it. But there's this scene in which she's in the room with this evil force, and there's this, as a totalitarian presence, it even has a rhythm of breathing. I don't know if you've ever read the book. You might remember the scene. I'm
I
not sure,
have.
but
Yeah.
it's actually making her breathe in a certain rhythm. Its control is such that it reaches into her lungs and is making her breathe. And there's this section in the book where she's like struggling to breathe out of rhythm of this force. And something about that scene and also the scene before that when she's on the street and all the kids are bouncing their balls in rhythm. Like it's this very
Yeah.
eerie scene of these they're quote unquote playing, but they're obviously not playing because they're all doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Something about that whole sequence and then culminating in her being in the room with the Force. It utterly gripped me as a child, and it was fear, but it wasn't like I went on and had nightmares, because it wasn't like a fear of like I watched a movie I shouldn't have seen kind of fear. It was a
Right.
bit of it felt like a bit of a transcendent, like the language you was being transported away. I was just caught up in it. And I was caught up in Neil Gaiman is another fiction writer I really love, and he has this whole
Yes.
thing about we should let kids get scared in stories. Like we should let stories scare kids, obviously appropriately and developmentally and all of that stuff, but like we shouldn't be too worried about that because there's a way we learn about good and evil that way
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
children. And I totally agree with him in part because I have this experience in my mind. Like Madeleine L'Engle was catechizing me in an imagination, a spiritual imagination about good and evil through reading that story, and it's stuck with me to this day. And I've reread A Wrinkle in Time, and it's like my short list of canon, literature that I go back to is that book in particular. And anyways, that was the experience that immediately came to mind. I was thinking about something that transported me away, and it ignited, in addition to learning about good and evil, like my moral imagination being formed, it also just was teaching me about the power of story. And even as I recount it right now, I can feel what I was feeling at that moment. Like, stories can collapse time in a way that's really, really amazing. And so I would say that I could go on. I could talk about The Hobbit. The Hobbit was another significant story for me. And of course, Lewis is up in that. A lot of people like me, Tolkien, Lewis, L'Engle. There's probably a list of names George MacDonald could be on there too. We come back to these names a lot for good reason, but A Wrinkle in Time would be the one I would talk about first.
I really appreciate that. And of course, as you mentioned, Langle points back to MacDonald, as does Lewis.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And I think somewhere on my desk here, oh yeah, right there, I've got her a collection, Walking on Water,
Yeah.
and that's always good to return to. And in that
Uh,
same vein, you mentioned Neil Gaiman.
mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've read his collection of essays and speeches from the Cheap Seats, which is more
No, I haven't.
connecting to what you're talking about, his theory, right? Sort of like Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. It's a
Mm-hmm.
continuation of that work just from Gaiman's perspective. So you
My.
should check that one out
Yeah,
sometime.
that sounds fantastic.
Yeah. Well, so for Lewis, what would be your favorite C.S. Lewis story?
Man, I agonized over this question when I saw you were going to ask it. So I'm going to give it multiple answers, if that's okay. So we're going to talk a lot about The Great Divorce, but whenever I hear people ask me what my favorite Lewis book is, and I don't put myself forward as a Lewis expert, I'm just a Lewis fan. I'm an enthusiast. But whenever people ask me what my favorite is, I always tell them it's either Perelandra or The Great Divorce, depending on which one I read most recently. So at the moment, it's The Great Divorce because I just reread it. But I love Perelandra so much. And I also have to throw in consideration, of course, I love Narnia, but I specifically really love The Silver Chair. I think if pressed to pick my favorite Narnia book, it might be The Silver Chair. So those are the ones I'd put in the mix, specifically. Yeah, Perelandra and The Silver Chair probably, since we'll talk about The Great Divorce obviously at length, but I'm happy to talk about either one if there's anything you're curious about between those two.
Well, I will say I'm curious about The Silver Chair because it's not often referenced as sort of someone's favorite.
Yeah. So yeah, why that one? It's a great question. I think there's, and actually this is pretty interesting. To be quite honest with you, I've never connected these dots until just now as I'm processing this on this conversation, but there's something scarier about that book. I think there's something in connection to A Wrinkle in Time and the fear that I felt about being in the presence of that force. There's something in my mind that's genuinely scary about the deception that the queen weaves over the prince in The Silver Chair and the possibility of, I think, of course I couldn't have articulated this as a kid when I read it, but like coming to terms with the possibility of being deceived to such an extent, and you can make a lot of connections to like, you can think of Plato's vision of the cave and being chained to the wall and thinking reality is what's in front of you and realizing there's a whole world above you. And like, I read The Silver Chair as a little bit of that, like Lewis kind of expounding on that whole idea. But there's something about reading it as a child and learning and realizing like, this is how deception can work when it's kind of at its maximalist, And of course, there's all kinds of spiritual things you can pull into that I wasn't explicitly thinking about as a child, but just confronting the idea of deception and how it works on a spiritual level to convince us to be so convinced something was real and not realizing that it's not real, and that there is a realer place, which this is going to hook right into The Great Divorce, obviously, but there is reality that's realer than you can imagine above you that you could live your whole life and not even know it's there. Something about that left a major impact on me in my formation. And maybe there's a connection there between the being scared of it kind of idea and some of the themes in A Wrinkle in Time as well. That's the thing I never had maybe connected before. But yeah, in terms, I love all the Narnia stories, and so many of them have left impressions on me, but the themes in The Silver Chair have really, really impacted me more deeply probably than the others.
Thank you. Well, and it is, to your point, how seductive, sinister, right, the deception can be, and most of all within ourselves.
Yes, and I think this is what's terrifying about it, is to be deceived to such an extent to think that what you see as good for you is the thing that's shackling you.
Yeah.
He really drives to the heart of that in The Silver Chair in a way that I think few stories do. That is scary, but it's also freeing on the other side of it too, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So far in this series, I think The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is in the lead as the most beloved Narnia story, but
yeah, and for good reason. That's a second place for me if I had to rank them, I think. But yeah, it's a beautiful book too.
Good old Reepicheep.
I was just gonna say Reepicheep is the best. He's such a great character.
Okay, Great Divorce time.
Yeah.
My first question is what makes The Great Divorce an important story in your estimation?
Man, so many things. So I was struck by a lot in just rereading it this week in preparation for this conversation. And I think one thing that struck me about it is how little theological content there is in it, actually, at least explicitly, and how much more it is about experience. I guess you could say phenomenology, psychology, and then getting into sub-themes of like addiction and the ways that we instrumentalize so much about life and art and beauty around us in ways that are deleterious. It's an exploration of all those things, and it's definitely not explicitly about God. It's more about people. The reason I think it's such an important story is because it is such an effective exploration of people. It's such an effective exploration of humans. And the permutations of that vague word sin that we like to use, but the ways that sin holds us captive, the ways that sin distorts our understandings of what's good for us and bad for us. Back to the theme of deception, we could talk about that. I just think that it's beautiful, and it is so penetrating in the way it's written and the imagination of it. I truly think it's timeless because it's an exploration of people. It's not so much an exploration of, I suppose there are some culturally bound things in it to a degree. Like, are there certain vignettes that maybe will not be as relatable in certain cultures and times? Maybe. But I think it's pretty close to being one of the most timeless things that he's written because of its deep exploration of human psychology. Although he would probably shudder to think that I just categorized it as exploration of psychology. But, there's all these things about it that just feel like they're so relatable to the struggle of what it means to be human. And that's what really stuck out to me on this particular reread. And that's why I think it's such an important book.
Good. And I think also one of the things that stands out to me is it's relatively straightforward. With respect to the characters. The characters' issues are clear. Their tension is obvious. Right? Mm-hmm. And they wrestle with it right there in real time.
Yes, and he strikes this balance. I like that you say that. He strikes this balance of making it clear, but it's not didactic. It's not heavy-handed. It's not pedantic. It's very clear. Like, oh, this mom has an unhealthy relationship with her son. Like, that's what we're talking about in this scene. Right. So it's not obfuscated or anything, but it's also not, it's not ham-fisted. It's explored. I think it's explored with sincerity and also just with a lot of insight into how humans think. This is what makes Screwtape so good too. I mean, it's a lot of similarities there about. Or to go to Perelandra, one of the things that I love about Perelandra so much is that the dialogues between Ransom and the Devil's Agent they're so clear and smart that an honest reader finds themselves agreeing with the Devil's Agent in the dialogues, and you find yourself thinking, wow, he's making some really good points here, like maybe they should sleep on the fixed island, and then you catch yourself like, oh my gosh, I'm agreeing with the Devil's Agent right now. And I think that Lewis in The Great Divorce does something similar where he gets at these issues where the honest reader finds themselves resonating with the sinful or addictive or short-sighted views of the characters. And I think that's what's disturbing, but also so helpful and so insightful about it and so relatable about all of it. And is in this clarity. So I like that you bring up the clarity of it. It's really good.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to actually, since you brought it up, I just want to hear your enthusiasm for Perelandra.
Sure.
In part because it's been too many years since I read it. So
yeah, gosh, yeah. So the space trilogy is not the easiest read. So I devoured Narnia as a kid, probably shortly after I read L'Engle and Wrinkle in Time. And I devoured Narnia, and then I was like, I discovered Lewis has science fiction too. This is amazing. He does fantasy and science fiction. So I grabbed the space trilogy as probably a middle schooler. And wow, I do not recommend giving that to middle schoolers. You have no clue what's going on. It's not nearly as easy to follow. So I had a bad experience with it initially, but then I did come back to it, I think in college, and fell absolutely in love with what he's doing in that trilogy. In particular, in Perelandra, my enthusiasm it kind of goes back to what I just said. Like, first of all, I love the thought experiment of the whole thing, like the idea of the silent planet being the one that fell into sin, and this broader view of God over the cosmos, and the idea that God could have relationships with other beings and other planets that are not affected by sin. I love that whole thought experiment. So I think that's an amazing premise for science fiction. I actually don't even know if it qualifies quite as science fiction. I don't know. It's kind of a hazy, I'm not sure how to categorize it as a genre, but for Perelandra specifically, the more specific thought experiment within that broader thought experiment of the universe that Lewis is building, like this idea of being at a front seat of an unfallen planet that is teetering on whether or not to, fall, so to speak. The way it's explored, and again, to go back to, I don't want to belabor that point too much, but just the way it's explored cuts through, maybe for those of us who were brought up in Sunday school and have an over-familiarity with the fall narrative and the serpent and the tree, and the way it's explored cuts through the over-familiarity of it and gets to the heart of what's at stake, when you think about a planet could fall and be turned in on itself. And then layer that on top with the insightful dialogue and really deeply, it's deeply theologically informed, but also deeply informed by just Lewis's understanding of literature and the human experience. I think he brings all those things together in the debates that happen between, like I said, Ransom and the Devil's Agent. And you know, when you read it as someone who's living in the silent planet, you're living in the fallen place, like, you know what's at stake because you see the world around us that's just racked with sin and greed and, you know, selfishness and war and violence, and you know it's at stake, and you're like, I don't want this planet to go in that way. And yet you find yourself seeing the points that the devil's agent is making. And like I said, the honest reader, I think, has to grant that there are really solid, seemingly solid points being made there. And there's something about the combination of all those experiences of reading that book that I think that book gets at those things in ways that few things I've read do. And it's just, every time I read it, it's so powerful. And I pick up something. Just like The Great Divorce, I pick up something new every time I read it. And so, yeah, I'm also an enthusiastic booster of Perelandra specifically.
Thank you. And you raise a very, very important point to me, and hopefully to those who are listening, and that is with respect to being overly familiar with the situation that we find ourselves in. Mm. That is a challenge in my life, for sure. And I'm reminded of Chesterton's quote regarding monotony, and that God has actually is the childlike one, just like the child never gets tired of their parent spinning them around, and the parent is exhausted, right? But that he imagines God every morning saying to the son, do it again, with the exact same enthusiasm and gratitude for this miracle, right? Wow. And how do we even come close to continuing to cultivate that and maintain that to some small degree? I mean, I'm desperate to do so in my own heart.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Thank you. Great Divorce, characters. Mm-hmm. Which ones surprise you?
And well, I think we're gonna talk about the portrayal of George MacDonald in a little bit. There's some surprises there, but the ones that, I don't know if surprise is the right word. The ones that certainly arrest me the most are probably the man who has the addiction that's symbolized by the lizard on his shoulder. The way that scene unfolds, I just adore that scene in particular. That's one of the scenes that stood with me the most. Ever since I first read the book, every time I reread it, it's the one that comes off the page the most. I also really am struck by the tragedian, the dwarf and the tragedian, and like the kind of victimization narrative that's going on around that scene. Yeah, I'll stick with those two. If I'll just end up listing them all off if I keep going because there's different things that come out of each vignette. But those are the ones that stick with me the most initially. I don't know if one of those you want to explore or.
Yeah, well, let's hit them both. What is it about the man with the lizard and the dwarf and the tragedian that jump out at you?
Yeah, I think the man with the lizard, a couple things. One is his back and forth with the lizard. And I think I can't remember if it's explicit or if he alludes to it. It's some sort of sexual addiction, I think, lust or something. But you can put any addiction in for that, you know. And the way... So for those who haven't read the book, like it's this angel is asking for permission to kill this lizard, and the angel says, or the bright one, I can't remember if it's an angel or just a heavenly person, but the angel says, I can't kill it unless you give me permission, and the angel's pushing and pressing and pressing. And the first thing that strikes to me about the scene is the way the man is dialoguing with the lizard, in my mind, perfectly captures the ways we rationalize our addictions. Perfectly captures it. And the ways the man equivocates, and he acknowledges, like, yeah, it would be better if, you know, I'm afraid of this, but not better right now, it would be better later, and the wrestling match that's captured in that back and forth, I just think it's like agonizingly perfect. It just gets it in my experience. So that's the first thing that strikes me about it. The second thing that strikes me about it is, and I underlined a few phrases, I wonder if I can flip to them quickly, is when the man is avoiding... Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll just add that for those who have the book, we're in the second half of chapter 11 is where this scene is found.
Yeah, I found it, and I found it here in my copy. There's two phrases when the man is equivocating on whether or not giving this angel permission to kill the lizard, and what the angel's response is, in my copy it's page 109, The angel says in two different occasions. On this first occasion, he says, "There is no other day. All days are present now." That, and then later, and then he pushes back, and then again he says, "This moment contains all moments." And those two phrases, when you're thinking about, I mean, so much about the Great Divorce is about choice. Yeah, you could argue that is what the book is about. And when you frame choice with those two phrases, like "this moment contains all moments," like if you're equivocating on what to do about an addiction, and you're wanting to punt and kick it down the line, like those two phrases are so achingly beautiful to me, to think about the choice that you make right now is a choice that is contained in all moments. There's something there that I just find profound is too light of a word for it. It really gets at something deeply, deeply important. And then the last thing I'll say about the scene is like what he does when the lizard is broken, and what happens in the transformation that happens. And the fact, I mean, this is what's so amazing. He could have left the scene at the lizard breaks and the man is healed. He could have left it there, and that would have been powerful. That would have been powerful enough, but the fact that the lizard turns into this glorious stallion that is the thing upon which the man rides into glory is like, I get chills even just verbalizing that. Like the idea of these addictions and struggles that we carry and wrestle with becoming the thing that not only that gets healed, but becomes somehow the thing that transports us into the real is so gloriously beautiful. And that scene, it's why that scene sticks out to me. I don't know of any other imaginative reconstruction of those ideas that is so poignant as that.
So good. And I'll say two things in response. First of all, thank you for validating my own intellect or my heart, whichever, because on my page 109, not that you can see it, but mine.
Same
That's
thing.
The two lines that are underlined for me.
That's awesome.
and I just want to explore a little more deeply this notion, as you say, he, unlike so many accounts, right, where the thing that has beset us is cast aside and destroyed or abandoned, whichever, it's no longer a part. In this case, I think Lewis is at the very heart of what it means to be made in the image of God, that all of those things are simply disordered desires that are waiting to be aligned and come to their full flourishing, right?
Yes. Yeah, so beautiful. Yeah, I'm flipping through my copy here, and that well, where my mind goes is the fact that Christ bears the scars in his resurrected body. You know, like there's something about, and of course, I don't want to push this comparison too far because obviously the scars of Christ were not an addiction, or but I think there is a deeper, continuous principle there about the sufferings we encounter, the wounds we endure, somehow, and I say this lightly because there are people who are subjected to true victimization that, I would want to be very pastorally sensitive in how I even articulate what I'm about to say to someone who suffered horrific abuse or something, or trauma. But I do believe in this deep, deep truth that the wounds we bear belong when they are healed and redeemed and restored, and we have that eternal perspective on them, and that we actually carry them into glory, and them being the places at which we can encounter God, actually. Like, if we allow it, if we allow the angel to break the addiction, that can be the very place at which we encounter God, and we avoid the pain. I also think of Eustace in the dragon skin, letting the pain go deep to shed the thing that needs to be shed can be the place of encounter with the divine. That then is the point at which we experience the transformation that allows us to experience what is real. To keep going back to the Great Divorce imagery, like that is the thing. To the extent we resist that, we cannot experience God. We cannot experience the real in that sense. Yeah, anyways, I don't mean to wax too much on that, but I just think there's something that's really, really powerful that speaks into suffering in a way that's not just like shallowly therapeutic. It's not like we're just gonna try to shallowly heal or get around this or try to put this behind me. It's like I'm gonna go through it with God's help and God's grace and experience the healing that's then gonna be the horse that I ride in on. There's just something about that I think speaks to the human experience. Yeah.
Beautiful. Any thoughts you would like to opine regarding the dwarf and the tragedian?
Sure. I'll try to. I'm an enthusiastic personality, as is probably clear, so I'll try to I won't gush quite as much maybe on this one, but I do love it, and I think I love it for very different reasons. It's not, it's actually interesting. There aren't that many in terms of all the if you read The Great Divorce as a series of vignettes, not that many of them end up good. Not that many of them. I didn't tally. I should have tallied actually as I read through, but I think the majority of them end up unresolved, we could say. So perhaps the stallion, sticks out because it is this moment of profound victory in the midst of all these other ones that don't end up that way. Maybe that's part of what's going on there. And the tragedian is a similar thing. It's like you go on this journey where it looks as if things are going to go well, but then there's this turn, and it doesn't resolve well, at least in the book. And I think part of what's so powerful about that scene, and again, just to set the context for maybe those who haven't read it, there's this very small man who's chained to the tragedian, who's this imposing figure. And essentially what Lewis is exploring here is the way that kind of a victimization narrative can play out in a person. And like a false victimization, not like a true one where you just kind of insist on blaming everyone else for everything that's wrong. And the tragedian, and the root tragedy, being in the name there, it kind of points to this, but like the tragedian is feeding this narrative, and the other man gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as the narrative kind of gets its grip on him. And it's maybe an on-the-nose image, you could say. Maybe it's a little too obvious, but I think it's still really powerful and true that it's like, yeah, as you let, and also picturing a victimization narrative as being a character outside of yourself that's imposing this thing on you, and that you get smaller and smaller the more powerful it gets. That's a pretty powerful and resonant image for me. And I think he does a really good job in the dialogue that unfolds in that scene. He does a really good job at taking you along the journey of, like, it does at one point, the small character starts to gain some stature and strength because the victim narrative is starting to lose its hold on him. And you start to hope, like, okay, yes, he can do this. He can turn this corner. He can enter glory. But then I can't remember exactly what the turn is in the dialogue and how it's portrayed. But the tragedian gets its hold again, and then there's a turn back, and he starts to shrink again. And I think Lewis explores really brilliantly the ebbs and flows of that. And you get confronted as a person reading it. You get confronted with, like, how do I do this in my life? Or how do people I love? How do I see this happening in their lives? And there's even a play there's a turn in the scene where the narrator who's observing this whole thing, I can't remember how it is, I believe initially he thinks the dwarf is holding the chain that's holding the tragedian, and then after some dialogue unfolds and he looks closer, he realizes it's reversed, and he realizes that the dwarf is chained and the tragedian is leading him along. I think that's a really, really great little subtle but important piece of the symbolism that's operating in that scene. And again, I just think it gets at another angle of what is very, very relatable in the human experience, that wounds and and what's subtle or tricky about this is that, like, sometimes we can be true victims that can still turn into a tragedian situation. Like, we can be victimized, or we can be wronged in a genuine, unjust way that still can turn into the very thing that Lewis is exploring there. So it applies to a broad range of situations and scenarios, but I just think it's very powerful. I think it's true. It relates to my experience as a person. It relates to seeing, as a pastor, I've seen people walk through lots of things.
Yeah.
And if you allow your heart to continue to be soft in these scenes, like, you can grieve for people who are caught in similar kind of narratives, the grip of a certain narrative, and it's really, really sad. But it's very profound and true.
Yeah, very, very authentic. And one of the things that jumps out at me with respect to your own vocation is, because I find myself doing this when I've been hurt, typically because of my nature, is to just gloss over and keep charging, right? And that balance, as you are coming alongside people, between those who basically just refuse to deal with it and confront the reality of what has happened and get healed, versus those who linger and become, make it their identity, so to speak, right? They just wallow in that. So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I want to read a couple, if I can. I have a few underlined passages from this scene. Page 131 is one that he says, "Those who choose misery can hold joy up to ransom by pity." That really, really resonates with me. And then he says, and this is a powerful, I underlined this and I wrote "wow" next to it. Page 135, He says, the demand of the self-imprisoned that they should be allowed to the universe, that till they consent to be happy on their own terms, no one else shall taste joy, that theirs should be the final power, that hell should be able to veto heaven. I mean, that is strong rhetoric, but it just hit me like a sledgehammer. I thought, wow, this is back to that theme of choice. Like, Lewis is really elevating the impact of human choice and human agency in the things that we encounter in this whole book, I think. And in that scene, he's exploring the ways that we can, given human stiff-necked, stubborn, resolute, we can blackmail the universe by our unwillingness to let joy take root. That's a powerful smack, and that's how I experienced it when I read it. I love it. It's very confrontational, probably one of the most confrontational passages in the book in my reading, but I love it. And I think it's at the end, probably it's at the end for a reason, because he brings you along this journey to then be hit by that.
Yeah. Boy, that hits, and so true, and I'm going to have to sit back and repent.
That.
Anyway.
Me too. Man.
Are there any characters that inspire you?
I love that question too. I mean, gosh, I don't want to belabor the scene. I already talked so much about the scene with the stallion, but I am inspired. I don't know if inspired is the right word. Encouraged. Here's what I'll say. I'm encouraged by the man in the throes of addiction. Not because he's a heroic figure. I don't think he comes off as a heroic figure. It's almost comedic in the minimal amount of permission he gives to the angel. It's not a rock bottom repentance, I've seen the light moment. It's he gives the barest moment of permission, and the angel immediately grabs the lizard. So I'm more inspired by the angel, and by extension by God in that moment, I suppose. I'm not directly inspired by the man as a heroic figure, but I'm inspired by the reality and the reminder that, I guess what it brings to me, to my heart, is that God, I believe this, that God loves to free us from what shackles us, and that all God needs is the barest whisper of a permission. Or I don't even know if I use the word need there, that might not be the right word, but what God is looking to invite us into, might be a better way to phrase that, is the barest whisper of a permission to break what inhibits and shackles and imprisons us. And God will take that, and there's going to be pain. We've already explored that. There's pain before the healing happens, but something about that reminder in that scene I find so encouraging. I'll also say I'm inspired. This is getting at it from the other angle, because like I said earlier, there's a lot of unresolved vignettes in this book, that there's a lot of not very likable characters. I'm thinking about the academic pastor. I think it's a pastor or a theologian who just wants to go back to hell to keep, writing papers. And, that is convicting to me because I'm a person who loves academics and I love reading and I love the idea of being published and, recognized for giving talks and stuff. And so I'm inspired not by the man, but by the fact that he refuses to enter glory. I'm inspired by actually what that teaches me. Also inspired by the painter character who similarly, my gosh, I love the way Lewis gets at this, where the painter he wants to keep painting. It's a very similar idea of he wants the accolades of being known as a painter. And the heavenly character is essentially saying to him, well, the whole reason you've painted is because you love beauty, and now you are in beauty. Just enjoy it. Just delight in the thing that your painting has been pointing you to your whole existence. And the painter basically says, no, I want to keep painting and getting accolades for painting. And so then he goes back to hell or purgatory or whatever the gray town is. That is also, again, not inspired by the painter. I'm inspired by the truth of what that brings out, is that all these things we grasp at are pointing to beauty and to enjoyment and to delight. And there's an element of we can get kind of perverted around grasping at the thing that points to the thing as opposed to the thing itself that we ostensibly are searching for, which is another massive theme of the whole book. So I think that, I guess, I'm kind of dancing around your question a little bit, but those are the things that I put down. Those are the things that I walk away inspired by as a reminder to be enjoy beauty. You were created to delight in beauty by the one who is beauty as such, who is good as such. You were created to enjoy that. So like, don't instrumentalize the things that point you to it. It's like falling in love with the sign as opposed to the thing the sign is directing you towards. That's just so inspiring to me. And it's also, it's good news. It's like gospel good news because it's very freeing. It's very liberating to be reminded you can kind of get off the treadmill of trying to get the accolades or the notoriety or approval or the whatever it is you're looking for, and just remember that enjoying beauty and enjoying delight, that you don't need accolades for that. There's something hardwired into us that I think really responds deeply to that.
I have a couple of thoughts. The first, it seems to me, in both those situations, the academic pastor and the artist is a form of idolatry.
Absolutely.
It is, right? And it also allows them to perpetuate a moat around them from ever actually having real relationship, I think, which is where things get messy. But I want to go back to your
That's good.
comment on the man, with the lizard and the addiction, with the slightest opening for the angel. And genuinely, this image came to my mind of a parent and their child at the swimming pool, and the parent's in the water enticing the child to jump, and the child's too afraid, and the parent gets ever closer and closer till basically the child just falls an inch or two into their arms. But that falling and the outcome of being caught then lets them go further and jump, anyway, that just came to my mind.
That's a resonant image for me because my kids are 6 and 3 years old, and we've been doing swimming lessons every summer. And yeah, there is something about it's really hard to articulate, but the experience of a parent and seeing the trust in your child's eyes in that moment, like seeing it and experience, there's nothing like that. And to think that that's but a microcosm of what we believe God's love for us is like, to believe that God delights in us trusting him to break our addictions. I mean, what a powerful image.
So much hope. Hope.
Yes.
Okay. A gentleman that has given me much hope is George MacDonald. And so what do you make of Lewis's portrayal of George in this book?
Yeah, it's so, oh man, I forgot how significant of a role George MacDonald plays. My memory of it before I reread it was that he shows up in 1 or 2 scenes, but he's really prominent. And I'm much less well-read in MacDonald than I am in Lewis, so I don't want to put forward any authoritative opinions. But I was really struck by, I don't know what to make of this. I was really struck by Lewis's take on MacDonald's universalism.
Yes.
Really struck by that. So I guess, let me say, first of all, before I dive into that, I think there's something really beautiful knowing that MacDonald had such an influence on Lewis. There's something really beautiful about his intention to include MacDonald as one of these heavenly guides. And which, by the way, sorry, I'm not trying to punt on your question. Things are coming to mind.
Go for it.
I also love the framing of like these figures coming out of the heavenlies to guide people in, and each one seems to have a significance to the story that's playing out. Like each individual story is connected to each of these heavenly figures, and the fact that again points back to this the underlying importance of story, like broadly speaking, that like our stories are bound up with each other, and that our stories can be the places in which we encounter the other that then can be ways we can be brought in to redemption. Something amazing going on there. And all that is to build up to say I love that MacDonald plays a role in Lewis's work here, because I mean, I don't want to speculate too much, but Lewis had a notable conversion experience. Like, he was not a believer for a big chunk of his life. I actually just finished reading the new book, The Mythmakers by John Hendricks. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
I've heard of it. I have not picked it up.
It is fantastic. I thought it was really excellent. And anyone who's listening to this conversation should definitely grab it because they would be interested. It's a illustrated but nonfiction exploration of Lewis and Tolkien's friendship, and there's a whole chapter on Lewis's conversion. It's really powerful. Anyways, I'm going far afield. What I'm trying to say is, if you zoom out and think of Lewis as this reluctant convert, as he called himself, and you think about him reflecting on the fact that MacDonald was in the background of his own discovery of myth and fantasy, and then realizing MacDonald was a Christian, and like MacDonald played a part in his own conversion, and I can't help but think that Lewis was imagining the role MacDonald's played in his own coming to belief, and then putting MacDonald in this book. I just think there's something really beautiful happening there, and I don't want to speculate too wildly, but I just have to. Lewis was too intentional of a creator for that not to be part of it. So I love all of that. I love all of that. I think it's beautiful that MacDonald's in it. What I was hinting at a minute ago, to get back to this, I wonder if MacDonald was more universalist than Lewis maybe wanted him to be. I'm not exactly sure. And again, I'm not a MacDonald expert, so I say this with like trepidation, but on page, I think it's 140, I'm going to flip to it. He basically has this dialogue with MacDonald, which basically he says, weren't you a universalist? And then he kind of, it's page,
Yeah, it's
did you get it?
140 in the copy I have, which has matched yours so far.
Yes, that's it, yeah. He says, in your own books, you were a universalist. You talked as if all men would be saved, and St. Paul too. So he's acknowledging this, but then he kind of has MacDonald respond with basically essentially equivocating on his universalism. And the way I read MacDonald, I think MacDonald was more confidently universalist than what Lewis is portraying him as here. So I don't know what to make of that, to be honest with you. I don't know if Lewis was hedging on it, if Lewis was uncomfortable with MacDonald's universalism. I'm not sure. I actually do genuinely like what he does in that dialogue. Like, I love he essentially is drawing this distinction between what we can imagine is bound by time because of our finitude and our creatureliness, and whatever happens in the eternal is beyond our ability to conceive of it. And so he kind of has MacDonald essentially pontificate on the difference there between being time-bound and being eternal, and the fact that we should. And I actually agree with this point. Like, I'm very sympathetic to universalism, but I'm also very wary of being certain about it for this reason, because I don't like transgressing the bounds of what we can know with utmost certainty. And discovering apophatic theology was a huge kind of big awakening for me as, a good conservative American evangelical who had never heard that word basically ever growing up. Discovering that was really, really powerful for me, is, in other words, acknowledging the limits of what we can know with certainty about God and what God is going to do. So it's weird. I have this tension in that scene, to be honest with you, because I like what he's doing with the dialogue. I'm not so sure if he's being true to MacDonald in that dialogue either. So I don't know. I've just kind of rambled around your question. I'm curious what your response to what I just said is.
I love it. At first, for those who are unfamiliar, could you give a working definition of apophatic theology?
Sure. Yeah, I just kind of lobbed that in there. Yeah, so there's cataphatic and apophatic theology, so to speak. I mean, these are really broad generalizations, but very broadly, the Western-informed history of theology and theologizing is much more cataphatic, which is to say, here are the positive affirmations we can say that God is. God is all-knowing, God is just, God is merciful, like positive, these are what we do know. Apophatic is the other side of the coin, which is to say, coming up to the limits, embracing mystery. Like, we can't address fully the depths of the Trinity. We can't address fully the depths of... How do we address the depths of God's mercy and God's justice? Like, whenever
Right.
we say we can't know that fully, we're practicing an apophatic theology. So, yeah, so that's how I would quickly, I guess, try to define the difference there.
That's perfect. And I think MacDonald would certainly qualify, because one of the things he takes down is ideas of the atonement, but he offers no theory of his own, right?
Yeah,
Because
that's true.
again, he's saying this is beyond our purview. My 2 cents, and I've explored this very deeply
Mm,
in my own life. So, like you, I'm not a scholar of Lewis or MacDonald, but a devotee of both. MacDonald's unspoken sermons, in many ways, have been a light for me
mm,
through my own journey of reconciling what I was taught with what I want to believe about the nature of God and the
yeah.
ultimate redemption of all creation. I think that this might be not deep enough, but I think that's really the issue, is that the term itself, universalism, is so tainted that
Yeah.
it's really impossible to have an honest discussion, because it's immediately castigated
So much baggage.
by
Yeah.
most of the group that I came out of. And I think for Lewis, this is something that I mentioned in a conversation with a gentleman named Wayne Fair, who has a channel called Sovereign Love
Mm,
on YouTube. And I think that it's, especially since we're wrestling with the Great Divorce, I don't think it's too far afield to imagine Lewis's own journey and the prominence that came to him, right? As I see it, typically in culture, you can either be a mouthpiece for a group or you can be a firebrand.
mm,
And I think that MacDonald would have been a firebrand,
Hmm.
And I think Lewis, whether I'm not saying he pursued it at all, but when you're put on the cover of Time magazine and everybody wants to hear everything you say, there's a bit of a feedback loop that brings parameters to what you are willing to speculate on.
Yeah.
That's my thought on it. And of course, like you and I, nobody can ever truly know what we think
Yeah.
because it's impossible to articulate. So that's
Yeah.
my thought on that journey with those two gentlemen.
It makes a lot of sense to me. It's an interesting, yeah. As much as I love this book, those couple pages are really interesting to me and introduce a little bit of attention for me because it does feel as if he's trying to hedge against possible accusations of being universalist. You know, it feels a little bit like this thing he kind of shoehorned in there. But I also like what he does with that distinction between what we can know from eternity's perspective or not. And I actually really like that point. So, yeah, so I have a little bit of attention around it, like what he's trying to do and what he's trying to accomplish. And I resonate with your hypothesis there. I think that makes some sense to me. And I get it as like someone with, I have a limited platform. I'm by no means trying to compare myself to Lewis, but I also get I get the tension there or the ability to be prudent or whatever it is, however you want to categorize it, of like when you know. And you're right. I mean, he was propelled. I mean, he gave lectures on the BBC to represent that's what turned into Mere Christianity, right? Like he was representing a mere Christianity to kind of the world in the wake of what was happening in the world wars, you know. And so, yeah, I get that maybe he was trying to be extra careful. I don't know. And I can acknowledge some wisdom there potentially, but it does just feel interesting. It feels a little odd. It doesn't quite, yeah. Anyways, I don't want to belabor that too much.
And perhaps it is a nice bookend with the way he introduces MacDonald in the book. I mean, it's clearly someone that he venerates.
Mm-hmm.
The language around his encountering him in this book and how he describes him is, nothing short of adulation.
Yeah, that's true.
Thanks for entertaining and humoring that question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Just a couple left. What do works like The Great Divorce provide to society and culture?
Oh, man. Yeah, I've hinted at all these things already in our exploration. I actually so it's interesting. I'm in my neighborhood. I'm really, really involved in our neighborhood life. And we've just gotten a men's book club up and running in our neighborhood. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person of faith in this book group. And I had the thought of suggesting The Great Divorce to this book group. I don't know if I'm going to do it or not. I'm gonna maybe I'll let a little more time go by before I try to spend any of my relational capital on that. But the reason that comes to mind is because I genuinely think this book has so much that's worth exploring, even to a non-explicit faith perspective. And the fact that it is very minimalist, or at least implicit more than explicit in terms of its theological content. Like, this is not an apologetics book. It's not Mere Christianity at all. I think it's even maybe less explicit in some ways than like Narnia is. So the fact that it exists in that space is why I thought I could potentially suggest this to my neighborhood book group, and it could be very fruitful for discussions because it explores so much of these things that we've already talked about. These themes like addiction and disordered loves is all over this book, and the ways that we people, instrumentalize things in creation and forget why they ostensibly exist in the first place, or the ways we instrumentalize other people, especially like our relationships to people like the mother and the son, that I talked about. So I think what this book brings to culture, society, is a potent and poignant exploration of universal human foibles. Like, it just brings these things out with beautiful language, and it brings them out in it's unique because it couches them all in a spiritual, imaginative framework, but without being polemic or without being over your head confrontational about the doctrines or, faith commitments. It's just an exploration of humanity. I've said that a few times already. And I think I've said this earlier in the conversation, but the timelessness aspect of it is because of the universal relatability of all these vignettes, I think. Like, if you don't relate personally to the painter or to the mom, for example, you probably know someone who does, or like you can imagine a family member or a neighbor or a coworker who you say like, oh my goodness, I've seen this play out in their life, or you'll personally relate to the next vignette you come up to. So that's why it's such a special book, I think. And we didn't even get into like, and this would be major tangent, but like we could get into what's happening politically, sociopolitically, and thinking about setting specific political commitments aside. We could talk about the theme of idolatry, and we could talk about the ways disordered loves plays into political allegiances or victimization. We talked about the victimization, the tragedian. Like, there's so many entry points. This is why I thought about it for the neighborhood book club, is because my thought process was like, I would just love to see how these guys respond to these imaginative conversations in this book, because there's so much that I'm not looking to use this book to convert anybody. I want to talk to people about how they experience these disordered loves and emotions and addictions and struggles and suffering and the concept of healing. Like, what do we do in our culture with the possibility of redemption? I think all that stuff is just beautifully explored here and put on the page in a way it's too, I don't want to say this is, I don't want to overstate this. I almost said it's too bad it's associated with Lewis, which is a crazy thing to say. What I mean by that is that he is so popularly thought of as the Mere Christianity Screwtape Letters guy. And I think The Great Divorce sets itself apart from those super explicit Christian works of apologetics that people could read without needing to necessarily feel like they have to have a faith commitment to appreciate it and learn from it. So anyways, I think that's how I would respond to that question. I think there's a universality to it that, also, because it's just kind of sorry, now I keep going on. It's also just a hard book to categorize. Like, is it a fable?
Right.
Is it a work of eschatological imagination? It's fiction, obviously, but what style of fiction is it? It's just very distinct. And I think that's something else that makes it special and potentially timeless. So I'll stop my gushing there. I don't know if there's anything there you want to react to.
That's great. What comes to mind, as you mentioned, our current climate was the chapter with the murderer and his former boss.
Oh my gosh,
and
right.
The bosses, just how clearly it displays tribalism and the way in which you label someone and they're that forever. Yes. And going to your point about, the opportunity for people to be redeemed, how often we categorize the other and there's no space for them to be anything but that.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a perfect connection. Yeah, and that's one of the scenes we hadn't discussed yet. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun, Joel.
Yeah.
Any parting thoughts?
Read The Great Divorce. No, I just I've really enjoyed this conversation. I love what you're doing with trying to explore in depth these works of literature. And I am grateful for the chance to have revisited this book that I hadn't read in a long time and be reminded of what's so beautiful about it. And I honestly would recommend to people, if you haven't read it or even if you've read it but not recently, it's one of those things that for me, I hadn't read it certainly not since I've had kids. And I've been married for 9 years, and it's possible I haven't even read it since I've been married. I'm not exactly sure. But what I'm trying to say is that as you gain life experience and experience new seasons, reread this book, because there are things like there's a reason the scene with the mother and the son keeps coming to mind for me, is because I have kids and it's the first time I read this book with kids. So if you've experienced loss and bereavement, or if you've experienced resentment because of a relationship with a boss or a colleague, or I don't know, the more life experiences you have, you can just always return to this book, I think, because certain chapters will hit you in a new and different and profound way. And that was my experience with it. And so I just can't commend or urge more highly the recommendation to revisit this really remarkable little book, and Perelandra too.
There you go. Well, it's encouraging to hear, and I wanted, if you're okay with it, just another moment to tell us a little bit about your YouTube channel, because
Sure.
you're quite a book reviewer in your own right. So your recommendations have a little extra weight given the veracity with which you consume content.
Sure. Voracious is one word for it. Manic is another word that I use sometimes. Yeah, I'm a little bit of a manic book consumer. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I run a humble little corner of the internet YouTube channel. I call it Books and Big Ideas. If anyone's interested, they can just search my name on YouTube and they would come up. But I review books, prominently explicitly Christian books, but not exclusively. I read a lot of I read a lot of philosophy, theology, and history and social commentary. So I'll review books by journalists that are coming out there because I'm really interested in cultural studies too. So that's primarily what I do. And then I'll occasionally put out a video essay on, like last week I put out an essay that I called the ABCs of fundamentalism, in which I try to diagnose I put forward my four characteristics that I see of fundamentalism, which I see as kind of a resurgent movement in our moment right now. So that's the kind of thing I do. So if anyone's interested in just keeping up with what books are coming out, I try to keep my videos to 10 minutes or so on my thoughts on particular titles. So any readers out there might appreciate that. It's a fun thing for me. It started as a COVID hobby because we were all stuck in our homes, and so I started making YouTube videos because what else? That was my version of, I didn't start making sourdough bread, so I did that instead. But that's what I do as kind of just a fun little hobby, and I love reading, I love books, so it's kind of a natural outlet for me. But yeah, anyone who wants to find me can follow me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for taking the plunge.
Absolutely. This was great. I'm really grateful for the connection, really grateful for the chance to have this conversation.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word scripturient. 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 Scripturient means having a strong urge to write or a desire for authorship. It is an adjective that has not commonly been used for many centuries. We're bringing things back here at The Plunge. We love throwback, retro, vintage, and by that we mean like 600 years type stuff. Scripturient reached out and said, "Hey, can we sponsor today's episode of The Plunge?" I'm like, you know what? Scripturient is a perfect word for this week's episode. I decided to say yes. I said yes to Scripturient, and I would encourage you to do the same. Cultivate the desire to write. It doesn't mean you have to write a New York Times bestseller or a memoir that moves hearts or poetry that stirs souls, but maybe just the exercise of occasional reflection and jotting down the thoughts that come to mind. It's very therapeutic, cathartic even. I'd encourage you to give it a try. In case you're wondering, the word scripturient comes from the Latin word scripturient, which seems like it's the same word. This is just from Gemini giving me this answer here. It's an obsolete adjective, according to Gemini, again. That means having a strong urge to write. We've already talked about that. The earliest known use of the word is in 1637 in the writing of Francis White, Bishop of Ely. Or Ely. I don't know. Anywho, may I encourage you to be scripturient. Maybe try it out pre-Valentine's Day. Really jot down some beautiful prose that expresses how you feel about your loved ones. Thank you, Scripturient, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.